Welcome to this Stratinis webinar about the role of the sales force in pricing. My name is Finn Hansen. I'm the CEO of Stratinis. Please be aware that we are recording the webinar for later usage. We will later make the recording available from our extranet so it can be shared with your colleagues. We'll also send you the charts to all participants as a PDF file after the webinar. We would love to have questions, and there will be time after the presentation to ask questions. However, we will initially mute all telephones to reduce background noise, but we'll open them up by the end of the webinar to take questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can also ask them by using the chat panel in the GoToMeeting software. Now, what is the role of the sales force in pricing? Well, overall, without the sales force, there isn't any pricing. The sales force works with the customers, and therefore they're the ones who are actually very often controlling the pricing. A couple of cases. The first case story I'm presenting today is a European beverage manufacturer. In 2009, they increased their list prices with 5% due to the growing raw material prices. At that time in their industry, raw materials were significantly more expensive than they'd been in 2008, and they felt the need to recuperate some of that lost profit. Therefore, they announced to all their customers that they were increasing prices by 5%. Unfortunately for them, the customers complained a lot as they felt that this increase was well above industry standards, and it wasn't really fair, and they didn't really deserve this, and it was a tough economic time for everybody, so they could just take a 5% price increase. But the company was firm, and they pushed the increase through. Unfortunately for them as well, there was a lot of publicity and trade chatter about that this was unreasonable, and that they couldn't really, it wasn't really acceptable, and many customers were talking about changing to other suppliers. Unfortunately also, at the same time, the individual salespeople felt ownership of their customers, so they actually went out and gave those customers some extra discounts and marketing funds to reduce the impact on their personal customers. And the end result was that net prices only increased by 0.3% rather than the 5% that the company overall targeted. So not a good story in terms of how to work with the sales force on pricing. The second case story is a global manufacturer, about 15 billion euros of sales in 2010. And in this company, they've created a culture in which the price increases are something not only accepted, but something that everybody expects in the organization, and that these price increases should happen every year, at least in line with inflation, preferably higher, but there's no excuse anywhere in the organization around the world, really, to not take a price increase at least in line with inflation. And they also have created a culture where everybody actually accepts that it may even cause dismissal if they're selling below corporate guidelines. So they have created a net price framework, a pocket price framework, in which everybody knows that you can't sell below this price, and if you do so, it's as bad as stealing from the company. And it's really, everybody accepts this, everybody works towards that. Well, okay, the minimum prices are there for greater good. When actually the salespeople meet with the customers for annual negotiation or any type of negotiation, the customers often exclaim, "Oh, it's you from company X again, so we expecting the price increase, but well, your products are usually worth it, so we do accept the price increase." And they've even taught the customers over time. It hasn't come from one day to another, but over time they've taught the customers that, well, in this company, we do increase prices. We do want to recuperate costs. We do want to grow further. And yes, we also have some brilliant products that are delivering value to our customers. So these price increases are justified. And actually, they've been so successful in creating this kind of culture that in a period over 5 years, 55% of the operating profit growth has come from net price improvements rather than from cost improvements or selling more quantity or any other type of profit drivers. Now, two very different examples of how the sales force has a great impact on how pricing is managed and how the pricing strategy is executed. And in this webinar, we're going to look at some of the common issues in pricing with the sales force. We're going to propose a framework for how to better manage pricing through the sales force in terms of pricing strategy, in terms of adapting to the types of customers. Some customers may be more susceptible to certain organizational setups than others. General company governance on who is in charge of pricing, how do you share responsibility of pricing with the sales team, how to share information and provide the sales team with tools, how to manage training of the sales force when it comes to pricing. And also a very important point is looking at the reward structures of the sales force. And lastly but not least, there's also a section on how international sales teams should be managed and how to manage pricing with international sales teams. Well, so what are the issues? Well, the first and most simple issue, but also the most important issue, is that if the salespeople's hearts are not in it, it's difficult to really execute anything in terms of pricing. That applies to pricing, it applies to any customer sales-facing initiative in the organization. And we've seen at Stratinis many organizations where there's a big difference between what the headquarter teams believe that should be done in terms of pricing and what the sales teams actually believe is possible or is acceptable, or the typical discussions are, well, we know how to sell, and then the people in the pricing team, well, they should just stay in headquarter and not really tell us how to sell. That is further enhanced as a problem, especially in organizations that are pursuing value-based pricing compared to, for example, cost-based pricing. Value-based pricing, as you all know, is very much focused on delivering value arguments to the customers, achieving as much value from the price as the customers are willing to pay. And that means that it's typically very heavy in terms of communication to the customer. It's very heavy in terms of arguments to the customer. And if the sales force is not on side and that kind of strategy, well, value-based pricing is doomed to fail from the beginning. It's of course also the case with cost-based pricing, even though in some organizations in cost-based pricing the sales force just becomes a messenger of communication, because everybody accepts or knows that it's based on cost plus a certain margin. But even in that kind of pricing strategy, there are also big challenges if the sales force doesn't support the pricing strategy. Very, very often we see that the big issue is whether there's a culture of profit maximization versus a culture of market share or turnover. Good example is from a conversation I had recently with a VP of sales from a large French organization, and he was saying, well, all these pricing initiatives, they're great, we really need to pursue them, but we can't lose market share because then the board of directors will have our heads, which quite clearly illustrates that they haven't really understood that pricing is about profit maximization. Everybody's just seeking to improve the market share. It also shows that pricing very often starts at the top. So if the board of directors don't really accept that this is all about profit and not about market share, well, then obviously the rest of the organization is going to follow suit as well. We do often see in many organizations as well that there's a challenge of sometimes adhering to corporate guidelines and policies when it comes to pricing. If there are rules at the corporate level about which kind of discounts every customer can be offered, or minimum levels, maximum levels, profitability levels, very often there may also be some diverging targets. There may also be some different targets. That means that the sales force may adhere to some corporate guidelines that they know that they can't get away with not adhering to. But on the other hand, they may also have some targets internally in the sales team or from the sales management that mean that other targets or other policies are not really followed. And because of either lack of transparency across the organization or understanding of the targets, it's very difficult to actually make sure that these targets and policies are followed. And generally, there's also a question about, well, how much commercial freedom do we need to give the salespeople? After all, they are closest to the customers. Do we need to allow our salespeople to freely determine prices? Do we need to allow them to determine condition types, on-invoice discounts, off-invoice discounts, what kind of discounts we give? Or should we restrict everything and just tell them to execute what headquarters decided? And that's often a very big discussion in many organizations as well. Another issue is that turnover doesn't really equal profit. We all know that, but you'll be surprised how many organizations are still focused on market share and turnover rather than profitability. Other organizations, for right or wrong reasons, are focusing on simplification of the price waterfall. In these two examples here, in option 1, there's only really one single discount, and in option 2, there are 10 different discounts. Now, from a price management and price optimization perspective, option 2 is clearly to be preferred, basically because it means that there's more profit opportunities if you can reduce one of these 10 discounts. It's more difficult for the customer to understand the net impact. It's also more difficult for the customer to negotiate away, whereas if you're only negotiating one single discount, it is usually much easier for the customer to negotiate that kind of discount away. And actually, we have from our annual international pricing survey several answers showing that only 24% of companies give bonuses on profit targets, whereas more than 60% actually give bonuses on non-profit elements, typically turnover or market share. And a few, the remaining 16%, then manage bonuses on a combination of things. Another issue is really that the salespeople are the translators between the pricing team and the customers. The sales team is closer to the customers than HQ managers, of course, and particularly in value-based pricing scenarios, or in companies pursuing value-based strategies, they can be the barriers to communicating values to the customers, either openly to communicate that they don't agree with the value-based arguments, or by simply a lack of understanding of the value arguments. Pricing information also needs to flow to the customer, often via the sales team, and therefore they become the gatekeepers of information. However, of course, and that's very often forgotten in organizations as well, is that market information should flow from the customer to the pricing decision makers, so that the pricing decision makers know how the market is reacting to certain prices, certain pricing logics, and can act accordingly. Another issue we often see, especially in big organizations, is related to access to information. In many organizations, the sales teams do not have direct access to ERP. In Stratinis, we have quite a few customers where one of the arguments or one of the reasons why they've started using Stratinis Pricing Suite has been to provide the salespeople with detailed access to pricing and profitability information for each customer. This can be for the lack of access to ERP, can be for complexity reasons. Many ERP systems were not really built with salespeople in mind. They were more built for managing invoicing or financial controlling. Or it can simply be for costs. I mean, an ERP license might be quite expensive, and if you need to add the entire sales force to that as well, it's quite a big investment. In organizations who have CRM tools, it's unfortunately the other way around. Quite often only the sales teams have access to CRM. I met a US-based company the other day where the argument was, well, the CRM is really only for the sales team, because if we give too many people or too many analysts access to CRM, then they're going to ask so many questions to the sales force, and they're going to really spy on them, and we don't really want them to ask all kinds of questions that are not driving our sales. Again, it does mean that the information is not shared as freely as it should be, and it means that salespeople are not really able to communicate back to headquarters in terms of pricing. And another challenge is very often the profitability information might be restricted. So it could be that profitability numbers are considered to be so confidential that they can't be shared with the sales force. We see quite a few companies where either, for example, costs are hidden, or even in some instances, when you're working in a subsidiary, then you're not told what the true cost to produce are. You're only told about the transfer price to your subsidiary from the central factory. In those cases, that means that the salespeople don't know what kind of profitability they're chasing. They don't know if one drug is more profitable than another one, and therefore it is of course very difficult to expect that they are pursuing a truly profitable sales tactic. And very often also complexity of system mean that they get ignored. We spoke recently with a company who just installed SAP, and everybody who was a user of SAP had been on a 3-day training course. And yes, if you are used to working with computers, it's 3 days of training and that's it. But some people in that organization were really feeling, well, we didn't really understand what it meant, and it's very difficult to reproduce some of these steps. And we just really want to know how much we're selling and what kind of profitability we're achieving. And we'll come back to some of these issues when we look at the toolboxes and how to work with the sales force when it comes to pricing. So overall, in terms of how to approach the sales force when it comes to pricing, at Stratinis we have this framework of 6 key areas to look at. First of all, there's the corporate pricing strategy, i.e. how do we implement our pricing strategy, and what's the impact of different strategic options on how we should deal with the sales force and pricing. Another important area is actually the kind of customers you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with local customers, global customers, whether there's a habit or an industry standard of leaving a lot of negotiation between the salespeople and the customers, and a lot of other different types of customers. Generally, of course, there's also a question of governance: who is in charge of pricing, how much freedom is given to the pricing manager, how much freedom is given to the salespeople, how much freedom is given to other functions in the company, and therefore how to manage, how to optimize the pricing governance. Very importantly, and even though it sounds easy, it's very often overlooked or neglected in many companies, is information and tools to the sales force about pricing. So how do you communicate about pricing with the sales force? How do you get information from the sales force about pricing? And how do you generally equip them to go out and execute your pricing strategy? Another important area is training. Not everybody is born a lean, mean pricing machine, so to speak. Some people need training, some people need communication, some people need to understand what can and cannot be done, and training is actually quite important when it comes to optimizing the pricing relationship with the sales force. And lastly but not least, reward structures. So how do you go about looking at how the sales force is rewarded, back to the question of should they be rewarded on profits or should they be rewarded on turnover and market share. And again, we'll look at some of that in more detail. When it comes to the pricing strategy, there's really 2 ends of the scale. One could say that either the sales force is free to price as they wish, or the sales force is completely restricted in how they wish to price. In our case, if you look at different areas of pricing, when it comes to, for example, value-based pricing strategy, you probably need to have a quite strong framework in place so that everybody understands what the value-based strategy is, everybody understands what the parameters are. But by definition, you also rely heavily on the sales force to communicate these value arguments to the customers, and therefore you'll tend to see that value-based pricing strategies do leave some freedom to the sales force. maybe not to decide the overall price or the overall pricing components. That's usually governed by the value-based pricing framework, but at least in terms of deciding within certain boundaries how they should be pricing. On the other hand, if you come to cost plus, you can have a pricing strategy full of freedom to the sales force, or you can have a more restricted approach. Typically, in organizations where they do have a lot of restrictions on what the sales force can decide in terms of pricing and discounting, typically there they are in a cost plus scenario. Even if they may talk about, well, we're pursuing value based, they're typically behind the scene, they're really cost plus. Other factors that impact prices or the pricing strategy and how much freedom should be left is also your approach to pricing. Price changes, hopefully increases, where, for example, if you have a lot of price changes, maybe because your raw material costs are fluctuating a lot, or there's a lot of competitive dynamics in the market, so you need to change prices very often. We do see that more freedom is given to the sales force to be able to at least add some flexibility in reacting to the market and reacting to the customer demands. Whereas if everything is dictated from headquarters and the sales team is more restricted, it is sometimes more difficult to really react fast unless you basically take the sales force out of the loop. But then one could argue, why do you need the sales force? In scenarios where you also are, as my second case study showed, when you're relying on having a consistency in price increases, for example, and you want to increase prices every single year, well, you do need some restrictions in terms of guidelines, and there's generally less freedom as you can't really control pricing, or especially internationally, unless you impose some restrictions on the sales force. The type of customers also have quite a big impact on pricing with the sales team. Local customers often mean autonomy to the sales team, so that if customers are really very regional, local, then you typically want the people who are closest to them, who are in most contact with the customers, to be the ones deciding on pricing and discounting, and therefore being able to change things accordingly. On the other hand, in some industries, they're characterized by a lot of global customers, which means you need more global rules, and that again means that the sales teams will be restricted in certain areas, for example, by a net price floor, or maybe a net price ceiling, maybe other rules related to specific customers, so that you don't have the suddenly, just because a key account manager in China decided to give an extra discount to a customer, then this customer's subsidiary in the US will say, well, actually we really feel cheated because you're giving us a lower price in China than you're giving us in the US. So global coordination and global customers often mean more rules as a result. Other areas can be, for example, the level of off-invoice versus on-invoice elements in the industry. Typically, on-invoice elements are more difficult to change, or are more rational and may apply to every single customer in most cases. So if your industry is characterized by a lot of on-invoice elements, you will see that it makes more sense to, or it's easier to control these elements more strictly, and not leaving so much freedom to the sales teams. Whereas if your industry is relying heavily on off-invoice elements, these are typically negotiated with the sales teams, and it's more difficult to set general national or international rules about off-invoice elements. Sometimes it's also more difficult to even create transparency on these matters. So if you are in an industry with a lot of off-invoice items, typically it's a sound strategy to leave more freedom and more decision power to the sales team. One of the challenges we often hear when speaking to pricing managers, though, is also, well, we have an industry standard. The sales team is telling me there's an industry standard, so we can't really tell them what to do. It's really a tough one because salespeople are there to interact with the customers, and they're supposedly the experts on that. If you really think as a pricing manager that this industry standards is used as an excuse rather than the truth, probably one of the tactics is about going out together with the sales teams and visiting the customers, understanding some of the discussions taking place, and really try to better understand whether there's any room for maneuvering in the industry standards. When it comes to interaction and governance between the pricing team and the sales team, one of the key elements is to agree on a common language to evaluate pricing. It sounds simple. In reality, there's a lot of companies where the pricing team is talking about one kind of numbers or key performance indicators, and the sales team is looking at something else. They may, of course, understand what the other ones are talking about intellectually, but if the sales team is focused completely on invoice pricing, because that's where they're bonused, or that's how their information systems are structured, well, then it doesn't help that the pricing manager is talking about value-based pricing and talking about pocket prices or net prices after all off-invoice elements. So having a common language, identifying what to measure, and measuring it in a consistent way is very important. Another philosophy or another point is to share, i.e. when you are working together as a team between pricing team and the sales force, make sure to share as much information as possible. We'll come back to this point, but it can't be said enough. The more sharing there is in terms of information, in terms of feedback, in terms of understanding each other, understanding the impediments and the challenges that each team is facing, the better actually the pricing managers usually perform. Of course, you can look at who is in charge, whether it's the sales team or the pricing team. Most importantly, though, is to make sure to define the roles and really get senior management to reconfirm these roles on a regular basis. We're currently working with a Swiss company where they had some issues on, well, they created a new position as a European pricing officer, but in that position they needed to still look at, well, what was the powers of this as a pricing officer, and it took them some time before they could actually communicate that to everybody in the organization, and therefore making sure that he had the right powers to do what he was hired to do. When it comes to information and tools, it is really about sharing. The more information you can share, the more information you can push to the salespeople, the better. Even though, of course, there's also the challenge of, well, how much information can anyone really handle? And also, in how many different ways can you look at the same number? A very good example is to look at, should you share simple pricing statistics on, let's say, a list of all the customers and the net price they pay, or should you give someone a tool in which they can not only look at the list of the customers and all the net prices they pay, but it's some sort of drilled down functionality where they can drill into all the details. They can look at all the invoices behind these prices. They can look at the volume mix, the product mix, all the details behind it. We tend to advise our clients that, especially when you're starting out with a new pricing tool, or when you're looking at changing behavior in the organization, simplicity is probably quite useful, in the sense of, if everybody agrees on this, these are the 2 or 3 KPIs we look at. If everybody agrees on, well, these are the reports we look at, and we will make sure we get these reports right, and we will make sure that we share them across the entire organization, and we will make sure that we act upon the results of those reports. Then you're much better off than if you're giving everybody a tool in which they can analyze all kinds of things, but there's no real structure. So you can argue that actually the simplicity of reporting, the simplicity of information, structures what the organization is focusing on, at least in the short term. Over time, or in more mature pricing organizations, it's then easier to add a lot of freedom of analysis and possibilities of analyzing any type of pricing data regarding segment, customers, profitabilities, invoices, simulated forecasts, etc. Some of the key tools to provide to the sales force when it comes to pricing, well, very often or very important are the value-based arguments. So if you're pursuing a value-based strategy, but even if you're pursuing a cost-plus with a little bit of value strategy, equipping the sales force with value-based arguments, allowing to share with them what works, what doesn't work, understanding why are we saying that this product is superior to the competition? Why is this product superior to doing it yourself, Mr. Customer? Those kind of arguments are very important. Another area we often see is to look at segmentation. Not only segmentation in terms of, well, these customers buy more than $1 million, so therefore they're gold customers, and these customers buy less than $1 million, therefore they're silver customers. But also, for example, if you do have tools to allow you to segment according to price sensitivity. Some customer segments, some customer types are definitely more price sensitive than others, and therefore you can actually, with a segmentation according to price sensitivity, you can achieve a much better understanding of where it is easier to get the price increases through, which was actually one of the tools that the company, the beverage manufacturer in case number 1 used. Access to competitive pricing, understanding where your competitors are, sharing with the sales teams, pricing competitor intelligence can very often be useful, and profitability simulation. This is one of the key ones when it comes to, if you have tools with which the sales force can actually look at what is my profitability of every single customer and every single product I'm selling, and also simulate in some sort of simple manner what happens if I sell more products, what happens if I change my price, and then that immediately see, well, then I increase my profitability or I reduce my profitability. That kind of tool is very invaluable for the sales force. It's also one of the areas where typically if you're installing tools or if you are changing processes where the sales force will actually look favorably at getting more tools. Sometimes pricing managers can be seen a little bit like a nuisance, or the spies from headquarters who are basically just asking information. But if the pricing manager can provide some profitability simulation tools, we very often see that then you're also their hero, because that means that they can better make decisions, they can better prepare their discussions with the customers and do their jobs better. In terms of training and people development, obviously every company and every industry is different, but we see it as a best practice to provide face-to-face value training each 3 to 6 months. It does sound a lot, and for companies who haven't been doing value pricing before, that can often be a bit of a strain. Obviously there can be arguments even like, well, we can't take people off the street for these training courses, but the return you get on sitting down with the sales force and actually discussing value arguments and looking at how do we communicate with the customer, how do we negotiate with the customer and ensure that we optimize the prices as much as possible, that is invaluable and should really be done every 3 to 6 months. E-learning, some companies go for e-learning as well and say, oh, well, we have many thousands of salespeople, so therefore e-learning is a good way of managing pricing training. It can be good and it can be useful, but our experience is it's better for refresher training. And if you're really starting new value arguments, or if you're really starting to focus more on value pricing as such, e-learning is really only good for refresher training and shouldn't be the substitute for the real thing, i.e. classroom training. It is cheaper, or usually cheaper, but there's no real replacement for providing face-to-face value training. Internationally, another important point is that it's important to train people locally, especially in the sales teams. Very often You can't expect that everybody speaks fluent English or whatever corporate language you're having, and therefore to actually make sure the training is done locally, training is adapted to, of course, to local languages, but also to local commercial practices, local ways of looking at business. It is quite important to train locally, not just making one model fits all. Obviously, also when you're recruiting new salespeople, make sure to look for profit-oriented people, not just people who can sell a lot of volume, but also people who know that there's a profit price to be had. And lastly, but not least, information. The more information you can give to people, most salespeople are really good people who want to do their jobs well, and if they do know that this customer is profitable and another customer is not profitable, they will act accordingly. No need to beat them all up. Reward structures. Well, it sounds easy and it should be easy, but it's very often not. Build elements of profitability into the bonus schemes, which does take time if you are currently in a bonus scheme based on turnover or market share. It does take time to move to a profit target plan. So therefore, it's quite important to make a transitional plan to make sure that you're covering the right steps. Maybe accept it takes 2 years to change. Maybe it can be done faster, but at least make sure that people buy into that plan as well. That's typically something that takes senior management support and can't be done alone, and therefore it will also take time, as it really touches on, at least in some organizations, on people's livelihoods if they have a high part of their total salaries depending on bonuses. Key things to look at are, for example, also whether the measurements are fair and accurate. So how do you measure? How do you measure profitability? Do you actually have the tools? Do you have the reports to measure profitability? And do people accept those measures and those numbers are accurate and that they are fair to them? And even though it shouldn't be completely dictated by what kind of money they end up with, please remember that changing the bonus scheme will change what some people actually can take home at the end of the year in terms of salaries and bonuses, and therefore it's good if you can simulate what's the impact of people's money in the pocket. Especially if you can show to them that by pursuing certain profitability targets, they can actually make more bonuses or make more money in total. Another thing to look at is whether to reward some non-sales activities that create values. That can be either having seminars with the customers or in other ways communicating value, communicating premiumness, communicating according to the pricing strategy. And by rewarding these activities as well on top of or as part of the bonus scheme, you can actually also steer people in the right direction. When it comes to what is easy and what is difficult to do, and how companies who are starting from scratch and wouldn't really have anything in place, information sharing should definitely be the first one. Create some frameworks, create some common KPIs that you all agree to, and start sharing information on customer profitability and product profitability, and make sure everybody has access to the right information. Provide some toolboxes for the sales force. Giving them the right arguments, giving them the analytical tools, giving them the simulation tools so they can actually pursue your value strategy. It's nothing like saying, well, we need to be premium, we need to be value driven, if your sales force doesn't have the right tools to actually go and execute that strategy. Regular training, relatively fast to implement as well. It does take a little bit of time, does take a little bit of money, but should be a standard part of any Salesforce pricing program that a pricing manager will roll out. Changing reward structures, now that's where we get into more trouble, or it will take longer time. Definitely takes senior management support, definitely takes, depending on how you structure it, will take more time, will take more effort. And lastly, if you are looking at adjustments to governance, either moving freedom away from the sales force into the pricing team or the other way, that is of course also quite difficult, or can be difficult in some organizations, as you're changing the way business is done between the teams. When it comes to execution on the global scale, one of the key differences or one of the key differentiators is also to look at international pricing risks. So if you do have two sales guys, one in France, one in Poland, who are actually dealing with subsidiaries of the same customer, it's very important to make them aware of their international pricing risks, so you don't suddenly end up with the French key account manager is basically pricing at a lower price than the Polish key account manager or vice versa. And therefore sharing information about international pricing risks and making these Salesforce teams work together is one of the key areas for an international pricing manager to help facilitate, making sure that the international pricing is consistent, making sure that information is shared across the relevant salespeople. Another area is placing your pricing managers according to your customer focus. So if you do have a very local execution, very local focus on pricing, it doesn't really help to have pricing managers only at the global level. You do need, in that case, to have pricing managers also at the regional or local level, so they can help execute and improve and train and reward salespeople accordingly. If you, on the other hand, have very international customers, obviously you can look at an organizational structure where you are more focused on international pricing people only. And one last point on that is that when it comes to value pricing in particular, the framework may be international. The framework may be following some of the same lines, but value positioning and why should the customer be valuing this product more than the competition, and why should the customer value the product at all? That's most important. Is very often a local question. In some markets, the customers may accept that this is a very valuable product and they're willing to pay a high price, but in other markets they may only consider it as a medium product. And it is very rare to see any product, any brand across the world where customers, consumers, depending on who's buying, that they consider the product of similar value in all markets. And therefore, value pricing must be implemented locally, following some global guidelines and some global frameworks. So now it's time for questions. We had a couple of questions already on the chat. One question is, well, how do you prevent a salesperson from giving a million euros in unjustified discounts? Well, the truth be told, you probably can't. And next truth to be told is you fire him if he does so. In most companies, in most industries where pricing, where discounting is left with the salespeople or negotiations left with the salespeople, I mean, giving €1 million is probably only a phone call away. He picks up the phone and calls the customer and says, well, I want to give you $1 million. Yes, you may have some control procedures. You may cut him off at his knees and say, well, he wasn't allowed to negotiate that on our behalf. But in reality, it's too late, right? At the moment the money is on the table with the customer, it's very difficult to retract. So the short answer is probably, well, yes, you can have some control systems, but make sure that everyone understands that if they are giving discounts that are outside what is acceptable, well, then the next step is dismissal. And that can be quite effective in understanding how to manage pricing. Another question here is, can you give some examples of best-in-class toolboxes for salespeople and pricing? Yes, well, one that comes to mind is a medical devices manufacturer who have actually created a small booklet or folder with a complete training program of the sales team. So they are they're training the sales force according to this folder every 6 months. But they also then leave the sales folder with the sales team, and they have a very clever system of changing things. So they have it both electronically and on paper, but it means that they can quickly deliver new value arguments whenever they're traveling the world. The international pricing team is traveling around the world, sharing best practices. That goes into the folder as well, and it's kind of like almost how should I price a book that stands on the shelf of the sales guy? And of course he doesn't look at it every single day. I mean, most salespeople like to sell, not to read books. But by making it easy to read and easy to follow, and also by sharing input from the sales team in terms of the content for that folder, they actually achieve to deliver quite good value, and it's very well respected by the sales teams as well. And over the last couple of years, 2 years, we've seen that they've improved their pricing considerably, even in a very mature market that they're in. Time for one more question. Another one from the chat. Why is it you can't make a global value pricing program? Well, as I said, you will probably have some global elements. You will have a framework that you want to push value arguments around the world, so your brand or your positioning of the same product is consistent. But also, if a French customer values your product at 100 because he sees that it fits very well to what he needs to use the product for, it doesn't mean that a Brazilian customer is going to accept will value the product at the same price. So therefore, even dictating to say, well, okay, the value we put on the product should be the same around the world, should be the same. It's actually a little bit the same argument if you're looking at segments, right? If you're segmenting your customer base, some customers are willing to pay a higher price than others. And within a country, it's often accepted that you can manage that through segmentation. But if you're completely arguing, well, this attribute of the product is absolutely key, and that's the only thing that our customer should value on. Well, guess what? The French customer likes that attribute, but for the Brazilian customer, that attribute of the product may be completely irrelevant, maybe because of climate, maybe because of his production process, maybe for various reasons. And therefore, you will always need some sort of local implementation or some local aspects of a value pricing program. So with that, we will finish today's webinar. If you do have any questions or want to follow up with us, our contact details are shown here on the screen. I'll be very pleased to take any questions. Our next webinar will be on the 5th of September, where we'll be talking about how to get most value out of price increases. Thank you very much for your time today.